Left and right, wherever you look, you will find people warring against God's good design, only to discover that the created order remains undefeated. People like Richard Dawkins spent an entire career attempting to tear down the Christian faith, yet this week he went viral for calling himself a cultural Christian. So, what keeps the church from defending God's created order if we have the facts and the worldview to back it up? It boils down to one word, in my opinion: cowardice. On this episode of Forge and Anvil, I will be joined by John Moody to discuss how we can defend the created order with bravery. All this and more, so stick around. Welcome to Forge and Anvil, where we hammer out uncomfortable conversations to sharpen ourselves for the cultural, political, and spiritual war that we are living in. My name is Connor. I am host of this podcast, and I'm a husband, a father, and a follower of Christ Jesus, just doing my best to represent him well wherever I can. As I mentioned in the cold open, I am joined by John Moody. So, John, I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourself to the audience and those who are not yet familiar.
Yeah, I'm John. I'm a husband. I have 6 kids. And I'm really just me. People always like, what do you do? Why are you special? I'm like, I'm just another average person trying to live a faithful life in a day marked by unfaithfulness.
And we appreciate that. And we'll definitely talk a lot about what it is you do exactly, because you're definitely being modest here. You've had a big impact on a lot of people, myself included, but I appreciate you joining the show either way. So just those of you who are listening, just to get some laundry list out of the way, of course, share this stream. If you're watching us live, go ahead and throw in your chats and we'll try to get to some of those and answer your questions where we can. But feel free to go over to our Substack, forgeandanvil.substack.com. That's where I post all the episodes of the show. I also have another show called In the Van, where I'm quite literally in my van in the mornings, giving you a quick breakdown of one particular story that's mostly affecting Tennesseans, because that is my hometown. And I'm trying to keep my own house in order first, but I do cover things that are just broad to the Christian listener as well. So feel free to check that out. And then, of course, I do some writings there. So again, that's forgeandanvil.substack.com. I appreciate that. So John, diving right in here. So again, like I said, you're being very modest. You've had a big impact on me. Thanks to you, I now sleep commando. So that's something that you can pat yourself on the back for. And then beyond that, I've got chickens in my yard now, and in a chicken tractor. I've got another a dozen layers on some deep litter out back, and then I've got some elderberry bushes that I just put in. I haven't harvested any yet, but that's brand new to the homestead here. So you've definitely done a lot with your food freedom. So maybe just a quick starting point before we get into some of the different topics. I want to keep this interview kind of unique because I know you get to talk about food freedom all the time, and there's a lot of different interviews people can find of you talking about specifics with foods and chickens and things like that. So I'll try not to dive too deeply into that and nerd out too hard on it. I'll try to keep it to some maybe more unique line of questions for you. But before we do that, go ahead and just tell people a little bit about Rogue Food, your work with Joel Salatin, your work with Thomas Massey, and feel free to plug your guys' next conference.
Yeah, so Joel Salatin and I became friends by trying to get arrested together. So most people aren't familiar with, but starting in the late 1990s and then all into the 2000s and early 2010s, the federal government was pressuring state governments to shut down local food operations and regenerative, sustainable farmers, especially farmers doing raw milk and similar things. So there's all these crazy videos you can go find of, Rawsome, which was like a hippie food club in California, being raided, guns drawn. Manna Storehouse in Ohio, Athens Locally Grown in Georgia. So just all these operations were being raided, farmers being drug into jail, being drug into court. And they raided my food buying club in 2011. And we were raided by the Kentucky State Health Department at the behest of, the State Health Department, some federal, USDA, FDA, similar organizations. And we actually beat them. There was a small group of us at this time who had all had different measures of success when facing, the brunt of a state or federal body coming after us and either our farm or, our farm distribution model or whatever. So like my friend Max Kane is just a total hoot of a human being. Michael Schmidt up in Canada, who has an incredible story of going toe to toe with the Canadian government now for, I think, 40 straight years almost.
Wow.
And so we all kind of found out about each other. And we're just like, it stinks to always be sitting back and waiting for the next punch to land, to always be, stuck on your heels,
Right.
as the saying goes. So we're like, why don't we pick a fight with the FDA? Why don't we go on the offensive?
Yeah.
And so we started to do, planned in advance. We would call the FDA and the USDA and be like, hey, on this day, we're going to bring raw milk from Pennsylvania to the footsteps of the FDA headquarters in Silver Springs, Maryland. And we want you to know we're going to be there doing this. So you have no choice but to respond. And it ended up being a super effective strategy where, we would help some farmers who were in the middle of fighting their state governments, like Vernon Hershberger in Wisconsin, Alvin Schlangen in Minnesota, Mark Baker in Michigan. So we would go to, their court hearings. We'd organize these huge protest rallies outside of their court hearings. We would train their farm supporters in more effective activism. One of my favorite stories from this time is Vernon Hershberger was a dad of like a dozen kids, a farmer in Wisconsin doing nothing but feeding his community. Very humble, just faithful man. And Wisconsin went all in after him. Took him to court, I think, on 5 like misdemeanor or felony charges. I mean, basically, he would be facing less legal ramifications in Wisconsin had he knocked over a 7-Eleven than he was facing because he was feeding his neighbors.
So wild.
And so we know he has a court case coming up. A bunch of us travel to Wisconsin. We spend like 3 days with Vernon and a bunch of his farm supporters, meeting basically in like one of the barns at his property. And we get to the trial a number of months later, and they're going through voir dire, which is jury selection. And the judge during jury selection, to start off, he goes, who here at jury selection today has heard about Vernon Hershberger's case? And every single person in the room raised their hand because we had successfully totally inundated that entire region of Wisconsin with Vernon's story. And he ended up, in spite of the judge and the prosecutor basically colluding to try and make sure he'd lose the case, he still ended up walking away almost a unanimous victory over the state of Wisconsin. And so we did stuff like that, but we also began to try and get them to stop going after farmers. We started doing targeted acts of public civil disobedience to kind of goad the FDA into having to do something about us rather than them continuing to go after single isolated farmers around the country. And so Joel and I became friends during this time, because what better way to make friends than thinking you might be spending the night in jail together?
Yeah.
And so, Joel and I, we became friends, and we were having lunch a number of years later, once the government had really dialed back its open type of, the government went from like war by judiciary to war by regulation was how things kind of changed. The the 2000s into the early 2010s, the government was using police to arrest farmers, harass groups, threaten them with jail to get compliance. And when that strategy, because of pushback, began to become less effective, they pivoted to, well, let's just put more and more and more onerous requirements in place using every agency possible. And so Joel and I were having lunch, and Joel's just like, I'm so tired of this. He's like, I just want to go to a conference where instead of somebody showing you how to dot the newest I's and cross the newest T's on the new 247 pages of government homework that you now have, they can just teach you to tell the government to go pound sand.
Yeah.
And teach you to circumvent rather than comply.
Mm.
And that was the birth of the Rogue Food Conference. You know, the theme of the conference is creative circumvention and non-compliance. So we talk about things like private member associations, or using the protections of a 501c3, which, you know, most churches in America, you and I would probably say for ill, are registered as 501c3s.
Right.
I don't think a church should be that, but you can register as a food church, for instance. There's a lady who was like, a 501c3 gives me all kinds of protections. Why don't I become a food church and see how far I can run with this thing and where it gets me? And so a lot of the things we talk about at Rogue are also viable to try in other areas like medicine and health and being a doctor, you know, all kinds of stuff. You know, so that's what Rogue is all about. Our next one is May 17th and 18th at Polyface Farm in Virginia. Then we'll have one this fall in Texas. And then we're going to have one in March down in Florida. I'm super excited for going to Florida in March and escaping Kentucky winter.
That's awesome. Cool. Well, you guys have done a lot of great work, and I've got a half a dozen Joel Salatin books in the bookshelf next to me, and you know, I've definitely done my best to understand regenerative farming, and I by no means have a farm. There's a short while there where I was considering going straight into the pastured poultry profits route, and so I did a lot of research on that, and then just kind of realized that wasn't the route that I think God was taking me. But either way, that's still been super influential. I mean, honestly, just the idea of God's created design is just has had such a huge impact on me and my wife, and just how we live in the last several years. And I think I always had a sort of conservative, Christian conservative, theologically conservative understanding of nature, and the fact that, you know, God created the world, and because of that, everything has a purpose to it and a design to it in the way that it's supposed to function. But the more I've just leaned into that idea of really understanding, pausing and saying like, wait, is this thing that we're involved in something that God designed it as intended, or is this something that we are trying to manipulate? So a prime example would be having children. My wife and I, when we first got married, we did birth control for about 1 year, and we both felt this conviction, like, why are we trying to control something that is not in our control? And thank goodness we did, because, you know, now several years later, we're extremely knowledgeable on the fact that birth control is incredibly dangerous to women and their health. And all that to say, you know, I really think that there's so much wisdom that we can gain from the created order. But beyond that, I mentioned in the opening how I think we need a dose of courage in the church to actually defend that created order, and not just the church and the culture at large. We have just crazy things going on right now, and I really was excited to interview you specifically because you and Joel and others like you have had specific run-ins where you intentionally took on the Leviathan and won, and we don't see that a lot. Right now in the state of Tennessee, there was a bill that was proposed to basically make it to where the FBI, when they come into the state of Tennessee, if they wanted to use local state resources or county resources to basically do an unfair investigation on someone, or, you know, some sort of a honeypot kind of trap, the sheriff would actually end up having jurisdiction over them. and the bill just wasn't even given a hearing in the Tennessee legislature. So, you know, despite being one of the most conservative states reputationally, Tennessee can't even move forward on a bill that would give serious protection to their citizens. And right now, there's a man, Paul Vaughn, and I talk about him a lot on the show because I really just am hammering at the idea that we are all Paul Vaughn. Paul Vaughn is one of the few people that are facing 11 years under the FACE Act for praying at an abortion clinic. And
insanity. You can burn down whole towns and cities.
Exactly.
But how dare you pray at an abortion clinic where babies are murdered? It's
exactly.
Well, you know, it's you know, there's two things going on even in a state like Tennessee where you know, you have a lot of conservative politicians who aren't actually conservative.
Yeah.
And this is partly because most of them just don't understand. You know, they basically embody Chesterton and his, you know, the whole world has divided itself into liberals and progressives. The liberals' role is to make mistakes, and the conservatives' part in this pony show is to make sure the mistakes are never fixed.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, you know, like so many politicians, you just when you talk with them about like truly limiting government power, it's, you know, they just can't even fathom that. It's just, it doesn't even compute in their brains. Like, well, what do you mean that the government shouldn't have these overarching, almost unlimited powers?
Right.
They just, it's just crazy.
Yeah, they just really don't understand the role of government from a biblical worldview, and they think that government is like a service provider, you know. And the reality is, government. I mean, the Bible pretty much lays out exactly what the civil magistrate is supposed to do, and it's got its very specific roles. But we have completely lost that to time, and that's where I think the church has done a horrible job. And so I wanted to talk to you, I guess, about where you think this all started going wrong, you know, with the culture and the church, because I know I've heard you talk about the boomer generation a lot. I've had my gripes with the boomer generation, but would you say it started with the boomers? Would you say it started earlier? What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, the one thing you see in the Old Testament is unfaithfulness is only ever one generation away. It's, you know, it's, we can point to particular philosophical trends, particular historical events, you know, because obviously the Civil War in America was transformative for the power of the federal government.
Right.
It was also transformative culturally. And for, you know, quite some time, the Civil War had economic elements that a lot of people, I think, don't grasp, that solidified New England America really having a dominant say economically and politically that lasted, you know, for quite some time. And that had cultural and other ramifications that then set the stage for, you know, what happened like with the Great Depression, and then the packing of the Supreme Court and the massive further expansion of the federal government that really would not have, had the war not gone the way it had gone and the South maybe won, well, then we would have never had the massive expansion in the 30s and the New Deal and the rapid expansion of the government then. So there's no one generation who is to blame, because you can look at every generation going back throughout almost all of American history and show points of compromise that they made that set the stage for further compromise down the road. And that's the hard part. You know, I always, you know, it's kind of like you have a building built on pillars, and there's hundreds of pillars holding up this building. And they're like, oh, like if I knock down one here, I knock down one there, what's the big deal? Because I have hundreds and hundreds of pillars.
Right.
But once you start opening up space, well, now people are taking bigger swings, and now they're knocking down 15 pillars at a time. And that's really kind of how historically things tend to run. You know, the earlier generations, to them, it looks like small compromises, small bits of unfaithfulness, but it opens up these huge barren patches that then just let things run wild. And, you know, that's how you get from, you know, guys like you and I, if you grew up watching TV, you know, we watched Doogie Howser and the Wonder Years that really began to normalize teenage sexuality and other things. To now you have teenagers being told to lop off their genitals. Like
right.
You know, our parents were a little bit uncomfortable with those TV shows, but the culture at large was telling our parents, well, no, no, no. And our parents were biblically illiterate, you know, because our churches were, who knows what they were teaching, if your parents were even part of church at all. And so, you know, because people are like, how do you get to transing kids? How do you get there? Well, you get there from Doogie Howser and the Wonder Years.
Yeah.
You know, you get here from this idea of radical autonomous individualism, which goes back to the French Revolution. But it doesn't, you know, it's not like somebody picks up a book from before the French Revolution, the French Enlightenment.
Right.
And all of a sudden they start transing kids. They start undermining all sorts of creational hierarchy and design and differences. And then, you know, you just get there eventually. And people are like, I don't understand how we ended up here. But I'm like, you know, we are the people yelling at you that you should have held the line. You know, you had so many places to hold the line previously. You know, on Twitter, just a couple days ago, I might have reposted it. There was a homosexual man who basically was like lamenting where we are with the LGBT movement. Really, really well-known homosexual man. And he goes, I'm just so sorry. Had we known that this is where things were going to end up. And I reposted it. I'm like, dude, there were, you know, they weren't the majority, but there were still millions of Americans in the 90s saying that if you normalize the acceptance of homosexuality mainstream, it would unleash utter insanity. It would not stop with the so-called monogamous homosexual relationships. And I'm like, you can't have your cake and eat it here too. Like, you know, I do think the World War II generation and and you know, the boomers so much aren't to blame themselves. Like they're very much, if you look at socio-politically, economically, they unleashed huge problems, but they unleashed those huge problems because of how they were parented.
Right.
You know, this is where when you hear people talk about the greatest generation, I say this, I try and say this as respectfully as possible, but I'm just like, the men who won World War II for England and the US lost the more important war at home.
Yeah.
They squandered their lives overseas only to come back and to lose their own nation because of just completely dropping the ball on basic things like marriage, family, sexuality. You know, it doesn't matter if you win wars out there if you lose the war at home. And that's clearly what that generation did.
Yeah. Michaela over in the chat said, I love how this goes back to how we parent. Our war starts at home. Exactly. And I know we did a conversation. It's been a while now, probably fall time, with Jeff Wright, C.R. Wiley, and my friend Noah, all about generations. And we had boomer Gen X, Gen Z, and millennial. I represented the millennials in that conversation, and it was a really fun conversation but that's pretty much what C.R. Wiley was saying. And of course, he's barely a boomer. He's like one of the last years of the boomer. We were all kind of the in between age gaps, but yeah, I mean, ultimately, the greatest generation really came home from the war, and a lot of them were distancing themselves. And I think there's just a lot of, to some degree, this is again where if we give them some slack too, they saw man-made horrors that none of us really have a good understanding of, and I think that really affected a lot of these people. And I think that they came back, and there was a lot of cold, harsh parenting, a whole lot of drill sergeant-esque parenting with not a lot of love in there, which, obviously order is good and discipline's good, but you have to pair that with love and truly caring about your children. And yeah, I mean, but to your point about the guy lamenting, if only someone would have warned me that this was happening. I thought I'd just go ahead and play this the Richard Dawkins clip here, because I think it's worth responding to. So I'll go ahead and just play it, and I'll get your initial reaction to it, John.
Well, I must say I was slightly horrified to hear that Ramadan is being promoted instead. I do think that we are culturally a Christian country. I call myself a cultural Christian. I'm not a believer. But there's a distinction between being a believing Christian and being a cultural Christian. And so, I love hymns and Christmas carols, and I sort of feel at home in the Christian ethos. I feel that we are a Christian country in that sense. It's true that statistically, the number of people who actually believe in Christianity is going down, and I'm happy with that. But I would not be happy if, for example, we lost all our cathedrals and our beautiful parish churches. So I count myself a cultural Christian. I think it wouldn't matter if we substituted any alternative religion. That would be truly dreadful.
Well, which brings me to my supplementary point, which is that, as we know, church attendance is plummeting, but the erection of mosques across Europe, I think 6,000 are under construction, and there are many more, are being planned. So do you regard that as a problem? Do you think that matters?
Yes, I do, really. I mean, I might choose my words carefully. I mean, if I had to choose between Christianity and Islam, I choose Christianity every single time.
I'll go ahead and pause it there because it's painful to watch. But so I don't know. Church attendance is going down, and it's a good thing, John. But can't we still just have Christmas carols?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Doc, there's a lot you could say about this clip. Dawkins is what I've always described as a brilliant idiot. Because he really is a brilliant intellect.
Yeah.
And you have to reach a certain level of brilliance to be able to say the dumb things he just said with a straight face. I'm not smart enough to be that dumb.
Yeah.
With the Dawkins clip, it's just, I say this to my kids. It's just like, everybody wants what Christianity, the fruit of Christianity. They just want it without a cross and without a king. This is what you saw in America with the modernist fundamentalist controversy. That's what wiped out almost all of the mainline denominations in the U.S., where, fundamentalism in the U.S. is what came out of this controversy. But you had all of these liberal churches, and they wanted the goods of Christianity. They wanted the philanthropy and the care and the work ethic and the stability and all of these things that historically you find really only in Christianity and a few other places, civilization, like, why is Africa technologically and otherwise so far behind the United States? Why, until if it wasn't for the Muslim religion, which is an abhorrent false religion, but because it gets certain things right, the Muslim religion and oil has made, large swaths of that part of the world begin to catch up to the United States. So everybody wants the goods that following God's design unleashes into the world around them. But they don't want the cross and the king who secured those goods through his death and then bestows them so generously.
Yeah. They want the gift without the gift giver. That's
Yeah.
not how it works. And it's just frustrating to me because it's like the sort of new atheists, which, Dawkins was kind of one of their four horsemen of, they really did so much damage in the, I think late 90s is right around when they came up, and early 2000s, going on campuses and going against Christianity and, having these debates, and many of the debates weren't even done in good faith with apologists of the faith. And, they spent all this time trying to tear down Christianity. And then they're like, wait, what happened? We took the axle off the car and it's not driving properly. It's like you wonder why.
Yeah. Well, and it also just goes back to too, nature abhors a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
Men are always going to worship something. This is very, very basic Bible. Dawkins and them like to think that we can have agnostic Christianity.
Yeah.
That modern rational people don't worship things. But I mean, Taylor Swift is an example of, like people are going to worship something. So you attacked right worship, and now you're horrified that people are worshiping the wrong things and you want them to stop. But you can't push them back to Christianity because you'd have to admit you were wrong, and you don't want to bow the knee. So it's, Europe is a mess. It's going to be, maybe the Lord will send a new Charles Martel to drive back the invasion. But maybe Europe is going to live under a season or an extended period of judgment via Muslim occupation. And who knows how that's going to play out. Yeah.
And unfortunately, it seems like America is beginning to go under similar trials, maybe not identical, but we have an open border. We have tens of thousands of people rushing over every month. We have, just since Biden's been in office, we've had the entire state population of Tennessee come across the border. And that's just who we know of. I mean, I'm sure that number is not even all of them, because there's so many individuals that go through that we don't count. And then recently they've uncovered, I think it's Todd Benson was the journalist who discovered that Biden is now flying people directly from their third world countries into the U.S. so that the border looks less bad, but the flow of people still continues. And so it's just absolutely ridiculous. And we're seeing these people bringing their ideologies with them. And there's some cultures just can't mix. We can't pretend that Christianity is compatible with secular atheist ideas and Islamic ideas, things that are false religions. And the largest group recently that I saw reported that came across was Chinese individuals, Chinese nationalists coming across the border. They were the largest people group in the last month or so that came across, in the tens of thousands. So, obviously there's people that are ideological and global competitors and enemies even, and they're coming across our border in wide swaths. So what do you recommend that we do, John? Because you are a prime example of someone who saw an issue at the local level and said, let's attack this. You specifically said, let's go on the offense. And John, I don't know if you've heard, but there's an 11th commandment that we are not allowed to break, which is thou shalt be nice. And if we break that commandment, then it doesn't matter if the other 10 are being broken, so long as we don't break that commandment. So how are we supposed to somehow fix our nation without breaking that coveted 11th commandment?
I'm just going to say, I don't obey man's commandments. I just don't care. If people don't find me nice, I could care less. Like with the immigration issue, at a state level, the hard part is with an issue like this, finding politicians with a backbone,
right,
who will actually do the things that are necessary to preserve the integrity of their state is going to be hard. But like, if I was a politician in Tennessee, I would be passing bills that barred illegal immigrants and their children from any state benefits of any kind, from any ability to vote, from the ability to get a license. It's, you basically use the tools God has given you to do what you can. I just, finding a Republican with, male anatomy and a spine is a hard sell these days, who would really do some of these things. So there are things that could be done at the state level to help insulate particular states. But then those states eventually are going to have to tell the Supreme Court to go pound sand.
Right.
When the Supreme Court comes along and is like, no, you can't do this. I'm just like, oh man, what's that famous guy who said, so-and-so has made his decision. Now let us see him enforce it.
Yeah.
Because that's what liberals have done for decades now. It always kills me when conservatives play this way, because the liberal playbook is to break the rules horribly, the so-called rules even.
Yeah.
So they'll break the rules horribly. And then when the conservatives have an opportunity to fix it, they'll be like, oh, you can't do that. That'd be breaking the rules. And the conservatives are like, well, I can't break the rules because I'm a conservative. And I'm just like, no, you're an idiot or you're a coward. Like, you're not a conservative. So you're a jellyfish.
Yeah. At the end of the day, it's like they want to be very pious and say, well, we can't stoop to their level. And it's like, guys, you're playing a game of Monopoly and the banker's giving himself extra cash. Like, you're not going to win against the banker. Yeah. So like at some point you got to start taking cash from the bank too, until the person that's been taking cash the whole game through realizes, oh, like no one's going to win if we're just constantly stealing from the bank. Maybe we should both agree to stop stealing from the bank and go back to some neutral laws and actually see how the political process plays out from there. It's self-assured destruction, mutually assured destruction that actually gets real results.
Yeah, because I mean, as we know, liberals are not going to go back to playing by any sort of, liberals got the country to where we are by playing with a stacked deck.
Right.
And the problem was conservatives let them choose the deck.
Right.
Imagine you're sitting down to like a game of life and death poker against another person, but that person chooses who the dealer is and the deck of cards you're playing with.
Right.
You'd be an idiot to sit down to that game. And that's what conservatives do. So good night, girly. Off to bed with you. So it's just maddening to me that, I've dealt with politicians on and off for a decade, and they're just some of my least favorite people in the world. I always tell Thomas Massey, I'm like, the only thing I dislike about our friendship is that you're a politician. I think one time he joked, he goes, it's the only thing I dislike too.
Yeah. And Thomas Massey, of course, most people know him as being basically the best congressman we have up there in DC. I know you've talked about this before, but why do you think that Massey actually has this ability to be principled of all things in Washington, DC? Yeah,
well, because Massey is like Tom Bombadil. There's nothing the people in DC has that he actually wants.
Yeah.
So there's just they like most people who get into politics want to be powerful. They want to be famous. They want to be rich. You know, that's why you can go check out the Nancy Pelosi stock portfolio track, because now they're tracking all of these Congress people who quite literally have better stock trading records than the greatest stock investment gurus in history.
Oh yeah, better than
And
Warren
there's
Buffett.
like, you know, dozens and dozens of Congress critters. And so Massey, he ended up in do you know the story of how he got elected?
I knew that he had served at the local level, kind of a similar situation to you, where he noticed a problem and he kind of went to address it. I think he spoke at a meeting for, I want to say it was an agricultural.
It was
bill.
zoning and planning. It was
There it is. Yeah.
They're trying to impose zoning and
Mhm.
planning out in Massey's rural area.
Yeah.
And he's
Yeah.
like, why do we need zoning and planning? And basically the people wanted zoning and planning because it would make them more money and it would make the government bigger and it would bring in more money for the government offices so they could hire more worthless family members.
Yeah.
And Massey fought them doing this, and he became kind of a local hero. And it was at just the right time that the national representative for that area of Kentucky retired, and Massey ran as part of that Tea Party wave.
Yeah.
You know, but we talked about how of all of the conservatives that were elected in that huge Tea Party wave, how many were not gobbled up by the Washington ethos and machine?
Mm.
And again, a lot of it is because, you know, Massey lives in the real world. He raises beef and chickens.
Right.
And
Right.
he lives in a rural area, and he goes home to peach trees and tomatoes. You know, it's very much the Massey knows when he goes to Washington who and what he's fighting for. You know, and most politicians are just there for themselves.
Yep. Yeah, and there's something about being close to the ground and God's nature that I think really keeps the person grounded. I mean, you can't believe that you can't believe that there's 752 genders when you know, when you're dealing with chickens and roosters all day long. There's a chicken, there's a rooster, voila. You know, there's just something obvious. It's the whole bell curve meme where the people on the lower spectrum like me are saying the same thing as the people on the high end spectrum, and it's just because, you know, the people on the low end spectrum are blue collar workers, and, you know, and they just actually just understand how life works because they're not overly educated like Christopher Dawkins, for example.
Yeah.
So I wanted to actually pull up Revelation 21 for a moment here, because something that I've been thinking a lot about is I think that the church needs to really make an emphasis on Revelation 21, specifically because I think that we live in a time where a lot of the reason why our leadership sells us out is not just because of money and fame, but sometimes it's just because they're cowardless, and they're completely cowardly. And to me, I read this verse a couple of years ago, and it absolutely knocked me on my butt, because I've read this verse so many times, but I hadn't thought of the emphasis here. And I'll just read starting at verse 6. And he said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty, I will give from the spring of the water of life without payment. The one who conquers will have this heritage, and I will be his God, and he will be my son." And then this is the part that got me here, verse 8. "But as for the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, as for the murderers, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death." To me, I thought that was so wild when I read this with new eyes a couple of years ago, that the first thing listed here is the cowardly and the faithless, of course, and detestable, and all that. You know, you could say that so much of that goes into our leadership class, but how many people in the church and professing Christians, you know, would fall under the classification of coward? I know for myself, I definitely was being cowardly, in a lot of areas of my life. And honestly, this verse kicked that right out of me, because quite literally the fear of God is just, I just have a greater fear of God than I do of man. But sometimes you have to read a verse that puts it into such a black and white perspective, where it's realizing like, hey, you're who I'm talking about here. You're the cowardly. And for me, it was not really living out my worldview publicly. I was, politically conservative, theologically conservative, but I did not want to step on people's toes, and I was scared of hurting friendships, to a point where it's like, man, I'm being cowardly because I'm afraid that's going to cost me something. And here I am, a father of two young children, both of which are under the age of 3, and I'm looking at the world they might have to grow up in. And it's like, luckily I came across this verse a few years back, because it's like, I just can't be a coward. And the reality is, I don't think I'm brave. I constantly am fearful about speaking out. I've just learned that I have to suck it up and 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 sort of put myself out there anyways, because that's the only way that you'll get over it. But I mean, what's your take on both that verse and then just the idea of our lack of courage and our overabundance of cowards?
Yeah. Well, I'd say the defining mark of the American church, Jesus says, whoever is ashamed of me, I will be ashamed of them. And it, after I went through seminary, whether it's like, because what is complementarianism at its core? It's people who are ashamed of the biblical teaching on patriarchy. So what is one of the defining marks of evangelical Christianity in America? It's cowardice. It's people who they feel bad that God said what he said.
Yeah.
That God hurt your feelings. We're so sorry God hurt your feelings.
Right.
We're going to be nicer to you than God. I'm petting my teenage daughter who's sitting next to me at the moment, who's now going to punch me back. So it's like one of the defining, just like the conservative, political, conservative church culture is really at this point built around cowardice. Oh, we're so sorry God said he's going to send you to hell. We agree that's unfair. We're so sorry God. Like this is what I realized with most churches in terms of like how they interact with women. Oh, we're so sorry you can't be a pastor. We're so, it's you could really literally feel this in a lot of the male leadership. It's like they'll look at them like we think God was unfair there too. And so it's just this innate, you will never be a brave person if you are ashamed of what God said and how he designed the world to work. You're just never going to be. And again, that's why our pulpits are just full of people. Because I think a lot of pastors, when you actually sit down and press on them, they're not Paul's who say, I am not ashamed. Paul says, Paul is like, you see this too with like bio logos coming out of Tim Keller and stuff. What was that entire effort about? It's because these people could not bear to be ashamed in front of what they considered real scientists. It wasn't, they tried to dress this all up as, well, we just don't want to have unnecessary barriers to the gospel.
Right.
That was a total crock. They needed something to cover their coward. What was really at stake is, well, they say the universe is 1 million years old. And when I say it's only 6,000 or 10,000 years old, I look foolish. And it makes me feel ashamed. And I'd rather I'd rather God be ashamed of me than have these men feel ashamed of me. So just so much of it is just rooted in a lack of a fear of God and compromising with men under the guise of evangelism, but it's all actually just cowardice on just such a wide range of issues. It's just all, again, like Paul was willing to be called a fool by everybody. He did not care that the Greco-Roman intelligentsia and philosophers thought he was a fool. He did not care that the Jewish synagogue people thought he was just reigning lunatic mad. He only cared for the approval of God. And our church, think about like our church culture is so much rooted in, like what is friendship evangelism? This whole crazy idea. Well, if you just get people to like you, if people like you, well, then they'll like God. I'm like, where do you see this in the Bible? Like nobody liked New Testament Christians.
Right.
Nobody liked them. You don't get stoned and chased out of cities. And you don't have Roman officials writing letters about you all because everybody likes you.
Right.
When I was in seminary, we had to translate the epistle to Diognetus. And it's basically like an early apologetic because the Christians were so disliked in the Roman Empire. They were just like a sore thumb everywhere they went. They were culturally a sore thumb, religiously a sore thumb, politically a sore thumb. And so much of our modern church culture built around likability is, really just actually, let's call it what it is. It's cowardice and it's compromise. And it's a rejection of the biblical view, not an embrace of it. I was looking at a church website today because I'm going home to my city of Youngstown, where I was born in Youngstown and haven't been home in a number of years. And since we're going to be up there, I was like, I really want to make sure we catch church while we're up in Youngstown. And I was looking at, like a possible church we were going to visit, and, our church's code is, we have chosen to harness culture to connect with people, to show them, like we empower the next generation. We are a house of honor, like we want to be known what we're for. As our culture changes, so will our approach. And I'm just like, where do you find any of this crap in the Bible?
They're just like, so yeah, we're gonna just build our church on sand. We're not gonna build it on the solid rock. That's all that says to me. Harnessing culture too. It's like, shouldn't your church be creating culture instead? Because we are the ones that are supposed to be most connected to the Creator.
Well, and that's what, why was Europe so heavily Christianized? Because the Christians created culture.
Yeah.
When in early America, when a church was at the center of every town, that's a political statement, that's a religious statement, and that is a culture shaping statement. When you're not allowed to have a building that is taller than the church, that shapes culture.
Yeah.
And modern Christians are just, they're just like, what? Like, that's, again, it's coward. That's so unfair. Like that'd be so like prideful and exclusive at us. I'm like, do you know the God you worship says he will give his glory to no other?
Right. How prideful of God.
So, so I've used that verse in Revelation a number of times over the past few years. Because again, so many modern Christians, their greatest fear is being called names by people who hate God. The thought of, I'm not going to use a coworker's pronouns, so people at my workplace are going to be gonna think less of me. They're going to think I'm bigoted or discriminatory. And I'm like, brother, so you'd rather God be ashamed of you than these people be ashamed of you. I'm like, you don't get to pick both. Like, you're being a coward. And the worst part is you're not loving these people. One of the defining marks, I said this in a Facebook post a long time ago, but it just struck out to me that one of the defining marks of biblical love is loving people enough to be hated by them.
Yeah.
Like, again, we're sold this bull crap that biblical love means getting people to like you. No, biblical love means living in such a way that maybe they'll like you, maybe they'll hate you, but you will be a rock solid beacon of the truth, regardless of which way that tide flows.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I know right now, something that I've been keeping an eye on is the SBC, because a lot of what we talked about is running rampant in the SBC. A lot of a desire to compromise, or at least that's what it appears by people in leadership. And of course, the SBC, they're going to be meeting in Indianapolis in June to talk about like the law amendment, which is basically just whether or not women can be pastors in the SBC and remain a part of the SBC, and a host of other issues, financial transparency and things like that. So a whole lot of stuff going on. But John, do you have any input on the SBC, any advice or anything like that for those of us who are trying to push for positive change?
So, William Wolf changed my mind a little bit on this. So, because I went to the flagship SBC seminary. I graduated from Southern. And so I saw some of the good and I saw a lot of the bad. And, this, I would love to be, I'd love to get together with some guys and talk about this issue. Because the SBC issue really plays into a larger issue, which we'll try and cover in a very few short minutes. But basically, maybe to help your listeners think about this, the world, power and authority is like pools of water. And there's all this water, all this power and authority in creation. There's a great book I read on this years and years ago. And intermediary institutions are historically what kept that power and water spread out in an even fashion. So one of the defining marks of what churches produce are strong intermediary institutions. It's like you think about John Knox in Scotland.
Yeah.
My daughter's like, I can go get my 13-year-old son is like a walking European history book. He's just
That's
ridiculous.
awesome.
I have the Roman history. He has.
And so, but what I remember is his church, the churches he spawned were so effective at philanthropy that they put the Scottish government out of business of caring for the poor. But they didn't do it primarily through the church. They built intermediary institutions. Because Knox, being a good biblical Christian, understood, like, the purpose of the church is the word, is sacraments, is preaching, prayer. It's not, but the church should produce people who solve these cultural societal issues. So intermediary institutions are crucial for checking run amok government and corporate power, which is why what is one of the defining marks of the last 60 years of American history? It is the washing away of pretty much all, intermediary institutions have either been weaponized against conservatives or they've been washed off the landscape.
Right.
And so we need intermediary institutions. I think William Wolfe is right here. The problem is I've yet to find a conservative who can explain to me a viable strategy for retaining the institutions we build. Because, think about like the Presbyterian denominations, the Lutherans, the, hundreds and hundreds of years of faithfulness and untold resources are now all in the hands of our enemies. Because this is what liberals specialize in. They're like an infection that they infect a host body and they overrun it. And now they control the host body. And so there are some questions I have that I've been asking for years that I've never found anyone who can give me answers. Because again, I understand, like, why was there such a push 40s, 50s onward to break up multi-generational families? Where did the impetus come from that your goal as a parent should be to get your children out of your house and as far from you as possible, to be educated by people from who knows where for what, so they can get a job Lord knows where.
Right.
Like when you step back and realize this was all part of a multi-decade attack on these intermediary institutions, you're like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Think about like when I was much younger, Rotary Club and all of these different civic organizations in towns were major players in the 60s and the 70s into the early 80s. Most of them are completely defunct or worthless at this point. They have no social, political, cultural power anymore because all of that has been sucked up into the corporate government nexus. So I think the SBC is worth fighting for. If I were to be elected SBC president, what I would probably want to see happen to the SBC is break it up into like 16 regional SBCs where, again, conservatives basically have a 0 for 100 track record of holding on to their institutions.
Yeah.
So I just don't know if long term you're going to be able to hold the SBC.
Yeah.
I was talking with Thomas Massey about this, but like on Twitter, a lot of people don't realize tons of very, very high profile Twitter accounts are payrolled. And some of these are so-called conservative Twitter accounts are payrolled by liberals or by fake conservatives, like the Cat Turd account. These are paid opposition AstroTurf people who are funded with huge amounts of money, and they have all the time in the world to do nothing but stymie true conservatives. So it's like, I'm just like, I have some questions about what are actual viable strategies for where we are. And I don't meet a lot of people who want to talk about these questions.
Yeah.
A lot of people want to talk with me about building a productive household because they understand that's part of the equation. But I'm just like, we need to recapture productive, geographically rooted, multi-generational living.
Yeah.
That is one of the most powerful intermediary institutions in the history of the world. And I think if people don't move back to that here by 2035, 2040, as the social fabric of America continues to just totally rip asunder, they're going to be like, oh crap, how do I get back to this setup? Because my kids are no longer safe. But we need that. And people want to talk with me about that a lot. But I'm like, we really need to figure out this institutional question. How do we build schools? How do we build associations? How do we recapture certain governmental institutions that are not going away, so that all of this water of power and authority isn't all sloshed only into corporate and governmental hands?
Yeah. I completely agree. Are you familiar with my friend Jeff Wright?
I see him on Twitter. We've never
Twitter.
met in person, I think, and I don't think we've ever spoke.
Yeah, so he might be someone that I'll try to connect you guys after this, because he's actually done a presentation called Institutional Bravery, and it sounds like he's asking the same questions you've been asking, and he specifically has come up with kind of a formula that I think is very useful. It's at least a good starting point. I'm sure he would tell you that he doesn't have all the answers to that, because of course, it's, like you said, it's a big question that apparently no one's cracked the code on when it comes to the whether theological or political conservatives are concerned. But yeah, his podcast is called Backwoods Belief. And one of the episodes there is him actually giving the presentation, Institutional Bravery. And there's an earlier episode where him and his co-host kind of talked through some of the ideas of his presentation, but you can listen to both the presentation that he gives and the actual episode where they're kind of going back and forth and kind of picking each other's brain on what he lays out in the presentation. But I definitely I think you guys would do well to connect and talk, because Jeff is one of the few people that I think is in a similar mindset to you of thinking about the institutions, and that's something that I've been trying to think on much more. And I'm trying to constantly think about where I can have the most impact. It's so easy to want to just get on here and talk about national issues and leave it at that. In fact, that's how the show started. I was just talking national politics, and I slowly realized I need to step away from that and talk more big picture as far as the cultural and theological. But then beyond that, now I spend my energy whenever I'm talking about specific news stories. For the most part, I try to focus in on the state of Tennessee. It's about the only place where I'm going to get more bang for my buck as far as actually creating movement politically. And that's, again, the SBC is something that I feel strongly about, that I can actually potentially have an influence, small as it may be. There's a lot of people in the SBC, but there's also a lot of churches that never send representatives. And that's something that I think if the SBC had more engaged, especially theologically conservative members, more engaged, there could be a big impact on how the SBC operates. And ultimately, if the SBC can go in a better direction, they're basically the biggest. They wouldn't call themselves a denomination, but basically the biggest denomination, in all of North America. So I'm really hopeful on that front. But I'll make a point to get you connected with Jeff after this.
Yeah, if this is a good time to end, I'll end with this story that's kind of a microcosm of the SBC. But I'm friends with a professor from Southern who was unjustly removed from being a professor by Albert Mohler. So-called conservative, which Mohler, I'm not a fan of Mohler at all. Mohler is who created Russ Moore. and helped create, and Aiken, two incredibly liberalizing influences. Moore used to be in the SBC. Aiken is still president at another seminary. But so, this was a beloved professor. He is a well-known, excellent preacher, raised 6 faithful daughters, just really great man. And he was unjustly removed along with Russell Fuller. John Harris did some podcasts with Russell Fuller about what happened, I believed. And, I was talking with his wife one day, and she goes, John, she goes, me and my husband never wanted to get into these battles or fights. We wanted to disciple people. We wanted to teach. We wanted to serve the church. And that's, when she said that, it really rung a bell for me. Because this man, I will never be as godly as this professor. I will never be as fruitful as this guy. He is one of the most wondrous men I have ever met in my entire life. But he really, in that area, embodies that generation of conservatives where, while liberals were, it reminds me in the Silmarillion book. The bad guy is Morgoth, and the good guy over all of the Valar is a guy by the name of Monwy. And Monwy lets Morgoth go from being imprisoned.
Yep.
And Tolkien says of Monwy, he could not fathom Morgoth's duplicity. It was so foreign to him. Just he as a pure being could not fathom the evil and duplicity of someone like Morgoth. And that's what struck out to me with this professor and his wife. They just really couldn't imagine that this would happen, that Moeller would allow Southern to be overran by critical race theory and compromise and other things after he rooted out all of the liberalism a decade ago. He would sneak it in through a new door because of cowardice and fear. And so, as you wanted to theme this episode, it really is the need of our day. We need conservatives who are willing to fight. And then you need to learn when to fight, why to fight, and how to fight.
Yeah.
And you just need to be willing to take the, if you're going to jump into any of these fights, you see on Twitter right now, all of the limp-wristed, effeminate-looking guys constantly, attacking bold men going into the SBC thing.
Yeah.
You're just going to have to get used to dealing with this kind of vitriol. Again, a lot of conservatives don't want to get their hand dirty. Fighting is a messy thing. You're going to make mistakes fighting. And that's conservatives have to get used to. You're going to have friends who might go too far on occasion. They might be a little too sharp in their rhetoric. And know that when you're in war, not every bomb and every bullet lands in the right place. And if that's going to bother you, then you just might as well fly the white flag now and walk away, because you're never going to win.
Yeah.
And so you really have to drive out, the greatest danger to us is not the people 20 steps to our right. It's the people, or I should say to our left. It's the people 2 steps to our left. because they're the ones who are always be like, oh no, that was too, yeah, you can't say that. No. Oh, that's so mean, So it's gonna be, I expect the SBC convention to be a brawl.
Yeah.
And it's going to be dirty. They're going to use, like they've done at previous SBC conventions. They're going to try and use parliamentary tricks and other stuff to really control. And if you're going to stop that, you all might have to do a sit-in. You all need, you might have to do things that make, and they say, see the other side, they're the bad guys. And you need to be calm and you say, no, we're no longer letting you cheat. We're no longer letting you bully. We're no longer letting you lie. We're no longer letting you steal. And your fake insults are not going to bother us anymore when we stand up to you stealing our denomination.
Yeah.
But you have to have people who have those kinds of cajones who know the tricks of the trade that the other side use and are willing to do what would be considered, undecorous things to stop them. And that's one reason, when I walked away from the SBC, I couldn't find anybody willing to do that. If I went to the SBC meeting and I knew they were gaming who was getting the mic, I would go to all my friends and say, we are going to do something about this. We're not going to let them dictate how this is going to play out. We're not going to let them manipulate the process. And if it means the convention goes south and becomes an all-out, really visible brawl, not saying like physically striking,
right?
But it gets things heated, and it really, I'm like, then that's what you got to do, and you need to have the right men right there in the center of that, who emotionally, maturity-wise, can take that heat, could be an absolute bulwark in such a situation, and not let them get away with it. Fight them tooth, claw, and nail down to the gavel.
Yeah, that's great advice, and I hope that we have that will. So just to clarify then, so you're no longer a part of the SBC. That I know that you are a Reformed Baptist, but not affiliated in a church with the SBC anymore.
Yeah, no, I decided, this goes back to the financial transparency. When I saw Russell Moore abusing the ERLC, I privately emailed him because he was a professor of mine, so I knew him. I went to Southern on a day off from work and sat outside his office the entire day. So I could Matthew 18 him. I was going to go to him personally, be like, dude, what are you doing? So I was going to, I tried to privately confront him. I emailed the ERLC and I asked for their financial documents. I said, hey, at the time I was a member of an SBC church. I was like, I'm a graduate of Southern Seminary. I'm a member of SBC Church. You're a not-profit organization. I would love to see your financial documents. How much are you paying Catwoman? Oh, what's her name? She taught at Liberty University, and she's like super good friends now with the VeggieTales guy.
Oh, with Phil Vischer.
Yeah, but she's like the one female professor who's just like total cat lady liberal, is on Twitter all the time. And she's being paid by the ERLC to write hit articles attacking things like the Billy Graham rule. I'm like, you're using my church's money that is given to the SBC, that is given to the ERLC to pay this woman to attack faithful men who have wise boundaries.
Yeah.
And the ERLC says we do not give that information to anyone but the board. And when I got that email back, and I also knew what was going on at Southern Seminary, I looked at my wife. I just said, I will never be a member of an SBC church again until this is fixed.
Wow. here's hoping we can fix it and
Yeah.
get you back in the SPC. I know that we're coming to our time here, but I want to, if you're willing, to ask you one more question that I think you probably have some good insight on, because it's a question that I think about a lot, but I don't think I've ever asked a guest this before. But how do you talk to your wife about being confrontational in these ways? Like how do you I guess we just live in a day and age. I've used this analogy before with my wife where I said, you see these old videos. I think it was The Patriot is the one I'm thinking of, where you see during the revolutionary times, and the British are invading, and it's time for men to take up arms. You see men of the church just stand up because the pastor called them to it, and they just volunteer and they walk out the door and they go enlist in the army, essentially. In today's day and age, it's like I just can't picture that happening. It would all be like everyone needs to go home and talk to their wife and have a conversation and see if they can, and not all of it's asking permission. Some of it's just like the niceties of like I have to talk to you, I have to make sure you're okay, and obviously there's a degree of that is correct and that's good, but at the same time, like I can't imagine, let's say a foreign enemy lands on the soil. I can't imagine being at church one Sunday and the pastor's like, we need to defend our homeland. And, like all the men under age 50 stand up and are like, all right, sign me up. And they just walk out. It all have to be like, well, let's go home and pray about it first. And then, so how do you actually address that with your wife and family? Like when you were going into the lion's den with some of the food freedom stuff, how did you have those discussions?
I know what story you're about to tell.
Which story do you think I'm going to tell?
When Mom thought you were going to propose.
Oh, yeah. So you might have heard this story. I prepped my wife before I married her. So she thought I was proposing to her, and we're out at a restaurant, and I look at her and I go, just so you know, I'm probably going to jail one day. And so after the Kentucky Health Department raided the buying club, and I risked going to jail by breaking their cease and desist and quarantine orders. A few months later, she looked at me, she goes, you were really serious when you said that. A lot of it. So this is, because people asked me years ago, why, because at the time I was raided by the Kentucky Health Department, it was 2011. So Abby was 6. Caleb was 5.
And Noah was about to be born.
And Noah was a couple years old.
No, Caleb.
Noah. Jess was pregnant, I guess, with Noah.
It was right before.
And people are just like, you're going to go to jail over milk. And be separated from your wife and small children over milk. And when I finally figured out why I did what I did, I said, no. I said, I'm not going over to jail over milk, but I'm willing to go to jail to make sure my children know I'm not a coward. That's actually what I realized back in 2011, because my kids have had to grow up listening to me. This is what a lot of parents don't realize. Like, your kids hear you complain about government overreach and complain about government abuse but what do they see you do? Do they ever see you draw a line? Do they ever see you take a stand? And again, like what a defining mark of modern conservatism is this never taking risks. Never be, this is why Elon Musk is so hated. Because here is a man who takes risks and just says what he says. I think we lost him.
Oh no. Oh no, the stream booted us for a moment. All right, you're saying Elon Musk, a man who takes risks. Go ahead.
Yeah, just like, here's a man who takes risks. Here is a man who he will just say what he says, and he does not give a crap how it makes anyone feel, what anyone says about, like he is just Teflon coated. He just does not care. So but we can end here because I got a sick wife I need to check
All right.
on.
All right. Yeah,
we'll
thank
talk.
you
I'm
for
sure we'll
that.
talk. But we'd love to see you all at Rogue Food. Again, if you get to come, it'd be great to have you. You get to hang out with Massey and some other cool people.
Awesome.
And so maybe you could pull off a broadcast from there.
Yeah, I'll see what I can do. I have to talk to the wife because as I already told you on Twitter, that's actually our anniversary. So gotta see if that's in the cards or if we're doing something else. So that's yet to be determined. But boy, would I love to, because I get to go to Polyface, and I'm sure it's going to be a lot of fun there. But thank you so much, John. I really appreciate you letting me pick your brain for a while, and you've given me a lot to think about. So I really appreciate that. Where can people go to keep up with you and everything that you're doing?
Yeah. For like my productive homestead, other stuff, I do a lot of that on my Facebook. For my spicier stuff, you can go to my Twitter. And then I have a website, John W. Moody, and we have the Rogue Food Conference and things. So you can hunt me down. So,
awesome.
And then I speak at a lot of homesteading and other conferences. I'm going to be speaking down in Tennessee twice in June and July. Once at Rory Feek's Homestead Festival.
Oh, awesome.
And then I'm going to be speaking at the Thank God for Bitcoin conference that's going to be down near Nashville. So I'll be, I'm not too hard to find most of the time.
Awesome. Well, I can definitely hunt you down at one of those events. That's for sure. If I can't make Rogue Food, I'll find you one way or another. So.
Good deal. Well, thank you, brother, for having me. You have a great night.
You as well. And thank you, listeners. Appreciate it. We've been Forge and Anvil. Feel free to check out our Substack, forgeandanvil.substack.com. We appreciate it. We'll see you next time.